Hello, hello, and welcome to my first list of 2022, looking at my 10 favorite albums of the year. I was gonna start this video with a disclaimer of, I didn't really listen to much music this year. I work from home these days, so there's not like a commute, and often if I am going places, I'm going with someone else, so I just don't listen to music as much as in previous years, blah, blah, blah. And then, on a whim, as I was making the slides for this, I was watching a few of my previous album list videos, and I've been saying the exact same damn thing since like 2016. It made me realize that when I say, oh, I'm not listening to that much music, I'm comparing myself to a version of me that's like, my mid teens. I'm going on 4chan's music board for at least an hour every day. I'm downloading every single album that's mentioned. I'm doing my absolute best to hear every single noteworthy release that comes out so I can put together like a top 50 list or something. And yeah, I'm not listening to that much music these days. I'm also not listening to as much music as the people who make the lists that I read on like Pitchfork or The Needle Drop or whatever. Those people are like professional music critics. They get paid to listen to music day in and day out. So I don't know. It made me realize that I shouldn't be so hard on myself. I listen to enough music. I listen to enough music that it saturates all the moments of my life where I want a soundtrack, that it gives vocalization and resonance to all the different moods I might have, and that when I get to the end of the year, it's tough for me to whittle down all the things I've heard into a top 10 albums. And I realize, that in itself is a blessing. I shouldn't think of this as inadequate. I shouldn't think, oh, I pine for the days where I had literally nothing else to do and would just sit there listening to album after album. Um, I had 10 great albums that made a big impression on me this year, and I'm really excited to share them with you. And that's what's important. First, we're going to talk about definitely the biggest runaway pop hit on this list, Beyonce's Renaissance. Uh, Beyonce, of course, one of the absolute titans of pop. And so each time she releases a project like this, we can see it kind of both as a barometer of what the pop industry is like these days, and also an oracle, because she's not the type to kind of be content doing what everyone else is doing, but instead is looking to what is going to entice people and what is going to wow people still. So in this, and here she's doing something that we've seen kind of intermittently from a lot of other artists kind of working in the R&B or hip hop genres, where they have, instead of kind of like predefined big radio hits that are destined to hit the top of the charts, she instead kind of gets this like playlist mode where we have just a solid hour of transitioning tracks that kind of move you through one continuous groove, that goes through like a wide range of moods but never kind of steps outside that structure, that always kind of brings you into the next one. And this, I think, is a huge reflection of like the Spotifyification of music, that nowadays people, instead of putting on an album which may have a pretty wide variety of different song types and structures and things like that, they're instead going to look for a playlist that's more kind of like smoothly integrated, that just kind of puts them in one zone for an hour or whatever. And this album, I think, really speaks to that desire. And she pulls you in so suddenly to this. The opening of this album is just crazy, that suddenly you're in this completely different mode, this different world. And it's hard to remember before track one. I love this kind of album. I love an album that kind of seeks to create an emotional space with you within an aesthetic world. That you just kind of live within the walls of the album for a little bit. It's not just giving you songs, it's not just giving you, a verse and a chorus, but instead trying to draw you into a specific kind of emotional experience for its duration. And on this album, I really love the specific types of music that she's kind of constructing this whole era with. So, as you'd expect in this kind of mode, repetition and iteration are paramount to this playlist experience. And as such, you have these loops that evolve both across each track, building up to kind of one major composition on each individual song, but then across the entire album you just get these really dreamy transitions where motifs will linger for multiple tracks and then reemerge later, almost like internally nostalgic. The genre here, the genre mixes is very, very eclectic, very fun. All sorts of things that Beyonce has kind of played with before, but now brought more to the forefront and constructed, not just kind of a segment of a track, but instead this whole kind of aesthetic landscape is a mixture of all of this. We have up-tempo dance hall stuff, something she's very noted for, something that's a really major pop genre lately. House of many, many depths, sometimes getting into like really interesting deep house territory, some like kind of classic Detroit-y type beats, a lot of disco influence, a feeling of bringing back the fun of disco without necessarily being burdened by kind of the tropes and hokiness of it. R&B being broken down and distilled into its actual elements instead of kind of the need for a whole R&B song structure. Instead, just kind of have the grooves of it or the bass lines of it or a hook that could fit into an R&B track being inserted into this overall blend. Same with like the gospel stuff that harkens back to the early days of her career. So sometimes just start singing in that mode or just kind of start bringing in the organs as this kind of little melodic break, but it's very quickly integrates itself back within this like churning dance hall environment. An eclectic mix of hip hop homages. What in the world, bro? We're already 6 minutes in, and I'm losing my English ability. This is something Beyonce does a lot on a lot of her albums, and I love it absolutely every time that she'll just sing a couple lines from like a famous hip hop song in a way that really reflects like she's probably been listening to this song for years, if not decades. It'll just get stuck in her head, and she wants to bring that experience of it kind of looping in her own mind onto the track. And then, my absolute favorite genre of all time, New Orleans bounce. I've been into bounce music for, I don't know, maybe like 5 years now. And I've really enjoyed seeing the genre push its way into the mainstream bit by bit. I love bounce in its purest form, stuff like those Black and Mild mixtapes where you have kind of like your 5 key samples and then some rappers from New Orleans just going crazy over that. But I've found myself really impressed with how kind of more mainstream producers will work it into different genres and kind of like reconstruct that energy while using kind of the aesthetics or the tonality of like more dancehall music or house music or hip hop music or whatever. It was so much to the extent that I got really addicted to the Drake track where he worked with Black and Mild. What's that called? So the Kiki, do you love me? Are you riding? And then that other one with the Lauryn Hill sample, that had some bounce stuff too. Both those songs I was way too addicted to for for a Drake song. But here on this album, I think they take another step forward with experimenting with the genre that it has that energy. She brings in Big Frida. It has the classic samples, but it's put into situations you've never seen before and just like channels that energy in brand new directions, which is so fun. And all of this, of course, is anchored by her undefeatable virtuoso vocal performances. Nobody sings like her. I mean, I think this is a big thing about people going, oh, Beyonce's overrated, because we almost take it for granted how amazing she is at singing. But a lot of her vocal performances on this album, when I kind of focus on them, when I think about what it's contributing to the overall track, I'm just blown away by what an amazing performer she is. The way she sings on this album, especially the way she kind of transitions between singing almost like operatically for a part and then doing some like rapping, doing kind of some weird kind of like shout singing, some spoken word stuff. It's like all over the place, and it kind of reminds me of music that they make on Drag Race, where it's like Beyonce is constantly like re-emerging from behind the curtains in an even flashier like costume, this even more out there surprising mode, and then delivering even more like quotable, shocking, catchy lines or whatever, like meme-worthy lines. And this kind of sounds like I'm making light of it, like I'm being dismissive. But it's a really, really fun mode. And it makes a lot of the tracks like really memorable, that she just kind of like comes in and does like a bit almost, and then comes in again with a different bit. It really kind of adds to making this like a really dense collection of memorable moments instead of just one kind of difficult to parse long continuous hour. My recommended tracks are Break My Soul. This was one of the singles. This is where the bounce influences really hit their peak. Big Frida, the Legend of Bounce, shows up and just explodes everywhere on the track. This is combined with like a really deep house cut, which I think is a sample from, I forget, but a notable house act is sampled on here too, and just the combination of like the kind of club rhythm of the house stuff with like the really interesting, rhythmically contrasted, super explosively energetic bounce stuff is phenomenal to me. I also really like this one, Virgo's Groove. It has this almost like kind of like tropical vacation-y vibe. It reminds me of the Avalanche's album Since I Left You. Just this feeling of like a utopia where you're just kind of relaxing and soaking it all in. But there's like an excitement, a rush behind it too. I think it really balances those well on a nice solid, I think it's like 6 minute long little odyssey. So yeah, good stuff. I really like Beyonce. I'm not, like a huge Beyonce cultist or anything. I'm never going to be like, yeah, this is album of the year. But a lot of her stuff is just really catchy, and I'm always very impressed with how well made it is. Okay, next we have A Light for Attracting Attention from The Smile, another Radiohead side project made up of Johnny Greenwood, the guitarist, Tom York, the vocalist and main songwriter, and then Tom Skinner, who's the drummer for not The Comet Is Coming, the other one, Sons of Kemet, the other experimental jazz band that gets a lot of attention. So, given that I'm a huge Radiohead, Tom York fanatic, maybe it's kind of surprising that this is ranked as low as it is, that it's only number 9. I feel like maybe that is what demands an explanation a little more than having this on the list at all. So, as I said, they worked with the Sons of Kemet drummer. So it makes sense. It's like a very kind of rocky, jazzy album. And it's a very potent combination. We have this really skittery, really jazzy, sophisticated, complex drums. Tom is in his most righteously angry mode in terms of the writing and the vocal performances. Johnny's playing the guitar in these like really reaching experimental riffs where he's still kind of in that like riffing rock mode, but it's really kind of abstract melodic patterns and stuff. And then all of this is sort of glued together with these really anxiety producing, almost claustrophobic, noisy elements that just kind of give that whole like Radiohead sensation of paranoid unpleasantness that I love so much. All of this is really potent, and I think it goes a long way in delivering the messages of the album, which generally speaking are about rising up from the hell we're in. Almost every track kind of starts off with diagnosing some sort of societal problem, usually quite abstractly, usually kind of speaking to an individual as some sort of archetypical example of the entire societal issue. And then Tom kind of like tears into them, and it's this sort of like victorious moment of knowing that you are more powerful still, like you can see through this deception. And this is all good and stuff, but have been such a huge fan of Tom York's solo projects lately, like Amina, Tomorrow's Modern Boxes, his stuff with like Fortet and Burial, which are a little more low key, very like electronic, very subdued. And it's kind of like that mode now is where my love of Radiohead has like really invested itself. So I just didn't get into this one as much, even though I recognize that it's like a really brilliantly composed album, and I think it has a very powerful and necessary message. And what I think is quite interesting is we see a total different perspective on this album as we do from those other Tom York projects. Like thinking about Amina specifically, what it feels like is this ever tightening, this claustrophobic, but also ever widening, ever more broadly applicable and relevant spiral of despair. And on this album, we feel like that lets up, at least for a bit, at least for the duration of this album. It feels like Tom's entire career is just the sequence of revelations that things are even worse than the last revelation seemed to suggest. That escape from this condition is even less likely, and the sadness he's feeling is even more eternal than perhaps he thought before. Just this continual recognition of, I feel hopeless, I feel dreadful, I feel trapped in my own depression. Oh, wait, I feel even worse now. I guess I actually secretly had hope this whole time. Well, that feels terrible. But throughout his entire career are moments like Hail to the Thief, and on this album, there's these punctuating moments where he's like, wait a minute. This is someone's fault. It's someone's fault that the world sucks so much. It's someone's fault that we're melting the polar ice caps, that the people we love are dragged away from us by the unfortunate circumstances and requirements of life, that people are mistreated and kicked down and never let rise up to their true potential. This is the fault of those in power. Fuck that guy. And this is one moment. This is sort of an interrobang, both questioning our division, our manipulation in modern society, and then giving a very decisive middle finger, which of course I will always applaud, even if it's not the sonic mode that I love these guys most in. My recommended tracks for this one are The Opposite. This is an early track that just has this really almost intoxicating melodic line that just seems to lead you down this dark, twisted path, while still kind of keeping you agile with this really driving, jazzy drumming and stuff. Panavision is one a little bit later on the album that starts with a very typical of Tom piano intro. It reminds me of his work on the Surprizia remake soundtrack. It's just very haunting. And then from that, they kind of build up the other major elements of the Smile, and it becomes this really complex, jazzy, hypnotic swirl around you. And I think it's just very good representation of the strengths of this album. Okay, moving along. At number 8, we have the new album by Björk, Fossora. One of my favorite album covers of the year. I love how this collection of strange, mushroomy stuff that looks somewhat subterranean is kind of like positioned as if it was the album's title. As if, you know, you could just sort of read this in some arcane, secret language, which I think really speaks to the feelings this album gives. So Björk at last returns from the inner earth to guide us back within, alongside with her. So Fossora is a variant of the Latin word for digger, and indeed, we dig deep on this album. Much of this album is a memorial to her recently passed mother, who was an environmental activist that worked out of Iceland. But there's no real sense of melodrama. She's not out here weeping and mourning and cursing the earth for taking her mother away. Instead, there's just this beautiful, honest attempt to reach the listener and to enliven our perspective with her mother's eyes, with eyes that saw the rushing earth, the living soil, the sprouting flora, the curious fauna. So, you know, with such a kind of beautiful, motivating message, I think it's almost insulting to kind of look at this and think, oh, it's that quirky Björk again, lady with the weirdo swan dress, and you know, this is kind of the typical way we view her as a musician, as this like kind of alien creature with this weird internal language, this elusive imagery. But I think, especially on this album, that kind of does a disservice. Much of what this album is saying is very beautifully simple. To love one another, to love yourself, to recognize the gifts that you can give to others, to love the earth, to love the natural phenomena that are unfolding around you all the time, to discover, to share, to spread, and to grow. It's just, even though, reading the lyrics, these sorts of things come across quite naturally, quite movingly, the way that she actually expresses herself sonically, that is pretty strange. It's very uniquely compelling. No one else makes music even remotely like this. The way that she instrumentalizes her voice, taking little vocal ba and and kind of turning them into something similar to her synths. She uses a wide variety of interesting electronic effects, and then also a full orchestra of woodwinds and brass that are tuned like very naturally, very openly. They really resonate acoustically as if they're really there. But she vocalizes those in such a way that they also seem to be speaking. There's a lot of points where the melodic line on the instruments and the sung line are the exact same, such that everything kind of feels like it's on equal footing. That she kind of has all of these elements, and she doesn't distinguish much between things that come from her voice, things that come from the computer, things that come from an oboe, and she arranges all of them into these really sprawling, beautiful neoclassical compositions. There's moments where they're very complexly arranged. It feels kind of Baroque. Just these small little counterpoint interplays between her voice and an instrument, say, that they feel like little crystals that you might discover in a cavern. And then that moment just kind of fades away, and you're opened up to even more enticing, darker depths. So, my two recommended tracks, the first one is Ancestress. This is the one that speaks most directly about her mother's influence on her, the things she loved about her mother, and the way she saw the world. It's a really beautiful track. She's accompanied by her own brother, who also sings about his relationship with her mother. This is one that I think really highlights this compositional mode. There's like a long sequence of small little verses that kind of each capture one moment in the experience of being with her mother as she's dying, or one memory of her mother and her in earlier life. And each of them have like a very intricate little melodic synergies, and then it just kind of ends, and then there's kind of like a space, and then you move to the next one, and it just has this feeling of exploring through a cave or a deep forest, and just finding these little lights and moments before heading further on. Fungal City is another one that seems to really speak to kind of some sexuality, some tenderness, some intimacy of the body. It features Serpent with Feet, who's one of my favorite voices in R&B, who really enhances a lot of these melodies, kind of singing counterpoint lines to Bjork and stuff. Really beautiful track. One of the more like fun tracks on the album, I would say too, like something very approachable. I would almost say catchy, but that doesn't seem right. All right, next we have a wonderful folk album, Dragon New Warm Mountain, I Believe in You, by Big Thief, who's becoming one of my favorite acts in the whole kind of folk spectrum these days. I was super enamored by one of their previous albums, UFOF, and to me that album was like the first warm, breezy spring day. And in contrast, I would say this new album, which is like an hour and 20 minutes long, is like a long, hot, humid day in the peak of summer. Rather than a surprise of something I didn't know I needed, it's like a whole lot of what I know that I love. So from the tense, fragile buds of their early work, where they were kind of exploring their sound and beginning to experiment and telling what were very crucial, important stories to them. Now we have something that I would say is like a very complex, very diverse, but still quite tranquil meadow, full of all sorts of different flora and fauna. The band feels very whole of themselves. There's no sense of anxieties or urgencies or fear in anything that they're doing. They feel totally unleashed to just celebrate together by making music. They meander from topic to topic, on track to track, like a deep conversation among friends where you start diving into side story, catching up on person after person, recalling and planning in one kind of long blur of topics. And sometimes you don't know what the heck the band is going on about. For example, what the hell does this title mean? Dragon New Warm Mountain, I Believe in You. It's like referenced a few times across the lyrics. Stuff like there's a warm dragon on the phone. Do you still believe in the dragon that lives in the warm mountain? And it's just this kind of like internal language that I don't think we can reasonably be expected to understand, or talking about the infinity that exists when the dust breaks up when you strike the earth to plant a potato or something. What is this? We don't know. But you feel very intimate because they're drawing you into something that kind of feels like a language born from friendship, a language born from shared experience. Sonically, things have become so huge, so like wholesome and like confident and self-indulgent almost. It almost feels like a parody, you know? They're out here twanging on banjos and whooping and hooting and fiddling away. But all of this is kind of awash in these really psychedelic tides of drone that sort of bring you in and out of different sections. In this excess, though, they never lose the really tight, almost like Baroque structuring to their music, both in kind of like the melodic lines, the breakdowns of choruses and stuff, the way things develop. It's all very planned, all very intricate, even though the kind of tools that they're using, the way they're singing and playing, makes you feel like more of like a hootenanny, way out in the woods when a bunch of people eat mushrooms. The drive behind these tracks too, like, never lets up, even when it's quite whispered and acoustic. There's still something that's always like pushing forward to continue to evolve and develop. That's very compelling. I would say this feels like the Appalachian Mountains and the Summer of Love in San Francisco, but all channeled via Central Park's strawberry fields. Because not that they're going around bragging about it, but they're not ashamed of it either, and it certainly shows that everyone in this band is like a graduate of the New York University School of Music. They have their absolute chops, and although they're really paying homage to these more ancient folk influences and stuff, and to all the generations before them, they're doing so in a way that's like so intelligent, that's so constructed of many many layers and such. Feels like an album of liberation that after quite a few very sad songs and albums, quite a few very vulnerable sharing of traumatic stories and stuff. Now it really feels like they're innocently rediscovering this fresh, bright world, and singing about all the wonderful things they're seeing. So I don't know. I've been having this like larger cultural conversation with a few people, where we're talking about the idea of like, what do artists owe their fans? And if you're an artist that has become very acclaimed and has really connected with a lot of people by, making art of traumatic experiences, of making art of the really dark places in your life, do you kind of owe it to fans to kind of maintain that connection and keep diving into those dark areas? Or, should your fans support you as you transform and grow and are able to kind of like leave that trauma behind? And I think in this album we see a very kind of triumphant answer to that, which is, you can be happy now. You don't always have to sing about the sad things in your life, and people will love it. This is by far one of the most loved and acclaimed albums of the year, and I think their most loved and acclaimed album yet overall. My recommended tracks are the title track, Dragon New Warm Mountain, I Believe in You, It's just very soft, acoustic, and something about when she sings the title line, it's just so cryptic, but she sings it with such passion that you kind of feel like you understand, even though, from an English language perspective, you have no idea what the sequence of words means. I also really like Promise is a Pendulum from later in the album. It's another one that's very stripped down, very minimal in its composition, but I think it really highlights how genius they are in kind of making something very rich and very engrossing from few ingredients. Okay. Next, we have the latest album from Pusha T, one half of the legendary Clips. It's Almost Dry. This is probably the album I've listened to the most times total in 2022. And the first 5 seconds of this album just completely say it all. It's a perfect microcosm and encapsulation of everything that's fantastic about it. You get this like really harsh, minimal quarter note kick, Pharrell's signature fourfold repetition before the beat starts. Pusha scowls out this really sinister, "They're gonna die." That was terrible, but you get this like Pharrell sample that's cut really abruptly and sort of entices you to hear it more later in the beat. Pharrell's production really blooms at this point, and then Pusha T immediately plunges you into this complex story of vengeance, talking about stuff that happened on Brambleton Street back in the 90s that he's still ruminating over, that he still wants to set right. From these raw ingredients, basically everything on this album is born from just those 5 or so ingredients that I mentioned in the first 5 seconds. We're given 12 slices of the life of the coldest man in hip hop. And these are just like flawless tracks, I think. These are just immaculately put together, immaculately produced. Pharrell is just in this like platinum age now where he's so refined at what he's good at. He's been producing stuff for Pusha T for like 20, 30 almost years. Pusha T too doesn't let up for a second. Every single bar like cuts deep. It's just cold as hell. Every guest is like very well spotlighted and accentuated, kind of bringing themselves up to their A game to survive in this like harsh world, but just flowing so expertly over these Pharrell productions. He tells stories, he makes his signature boasts about his cocaine sales and the wealth from that, his legacy in hip hop, and then of course balances that with some regrets, with some feelings of loss, with some feelings of like, despite all this, I still can't have it all, despite all this, still can't have that connection back, still can't bring that person back from the dead. And it's like, man, I've been a Pusha T fan for so long. How long am I really going to listen to this guy just rap about selling cocaine? Because I'd say a solid 65% of the lyrics on this album are just about selling cocaine. And I'll just do it for fucking ever. If he wants to keep making music this good, I will keep listening to it with a smile on my face. As hip-hop in general changes, Pusha, of course, evolves with it. On this album, he has Lil Uzi Vert and Don Toliver, definite like flag bearers of a new generation of hip hop, and he works with them like really really well. But he keeps leveling up in his own way too. He keeps his particular style, his type of flows, his like super cold perspective, always in the the forefront of like what we could call like the hip hop meta. He keeps it relevant. This dedicated character expert. I don't know. I can't express this in a way that's not like super nerdy. Talking about Pusha T like maining some character and managing to keep them relevant even though the meta keeps advancing. That's like nerdy as hell. But it's so cool to me. It's so cool to me that this is actually something he's able to do. His longevity just boosts his legendary status more and more and more. It more boldly underscores the fact that he has the talent and he has the drive to keep pushing. His name is Pusha T, but he keeps pushing. It's like 30 years after his career started. now he is officially a superset of Kanye's career. He started before him. He helped Kanye become who he was. The legendary Pusha T is everything moment, where Kanye talked about how influential Pusha T was on the idea of kind of like high fashion and rap, about how luxury could be so like cold and commanding. And now Pusha T has solidly outlived Kanye too, and presumably will keep making excellent music after Kanye continues to spiral into anti-Semitic, anti-black, anti-everyone nonsense. So it seems very fitting that perhaps Kanye's final good music, I guess in both ways, good music itself is probably dying the record label, but Kanye's last good verses in production probably appear on this album. That seems quite fitting, I think, for kind of this legendary career that worked so deeply and intimately with Kanye all through his time. Kanye has two verses on this album, on two tracks that he also helped produce, and they're both phenomenal. My recommended tracks are Brambleton. This is the opening track that I talked about. I think it is just like a perfect microcosm of the album. It's so tight. The story told over it is so compelling. It just, I don't know, it's just everything I want from him. And then Rock and Roll, the track that features Kanye and Kid Cudi. Cudi, after this album came out, went on Twitter and was like, just to make it clear, I would not make a song with Kanye today. This was recorded however many months or years ago, and this is the last time you're ever going to hear us on a track together. But I think it's a pretty good send-off of that relationship, too. Kanye's verse is just fantastic. It's actually, like, maybe one of my favorite verses from him ever. Just kind of half singing, half rapping in this, like, really desperate mode. Just on the edge of, like, going from that line from genius to crazy. Great album. As I said, I've been listening to it so much. It just hits every single time. You know, something that's like fun to listen to too, versus some of the other albums are, you know, more intense. Whereas this is just like, damn, that's good rapping. Next we have another fantastic hip hop album that is indeed a little more intense, but also something that very quickly worked its way into my regular rotation. Lil Simz's new album, No Thank You. This is kind of like a semi-sequel to her previous album, Sometimes I Might Be Introvert, which came out last year and was kind of her first really breakout success. It got a ton of critical attention, it got some award nominations. Somewhat embarrassingly, she was nominated for like Best New Artist at the Grammys, even though this was like her fifth album or something, but we can't expect the Grammys to know what's going on. And her success, I say here, for better or for worse, because with a sudden overnight breakout sensation comes a lot of complications. Generally, I find myself really enjoying what I would think of as kind of like reflective follow-up albums, where an artist has something that's a huge success, and then they take the opportunity to kind of write more on what that success meant to them, still kind of within the mode of the previous album. The example that comes to mind most readily is Mount Erie's Now Only, an album he made as a follow-up to A Crow Looked at Me, which was all about the death of his wife. And then Now Only was kind of like checking in on how the success of A Crow Looked at Me made him feel, and how he's doing now with that whole situation. The dynamics, I think, between this vulnerable statement of self resonated with so many people. But it's myself. Can I really let it belong to everyone? Can I keep going on stage again and again and performing this vulnerable statement of self? And this again is fitting into what I was talking about, this much greater cultural conversation about what do artists owe us when they've delivered something so personal. With Sims, there's this bonus element of, am I getting screwed? That she has this huge success, that she has something that was on so many critics' lists last year. Shouldn't she be rich? Shouldn't she be getting heavily paid off of all of this? A lot of this album is navigating the antagonisms of fame from her fans that suddenly demand so much, that feel entitled to so much, and even more demanding, even more entitled, the music industry itself. She basically kind of like works through her contract here, points out all of the things that are unfair, all the things that are exploitive, all the ways they kind of like tricked her, and how she kind of vows to not let them get away with that. And then, and this is my favorite power that someone making such music, making such art can do, is expanding this kind of experience to not just the personal, but to an archetype of artists, of black women, of people that become successful like this. Making something that's really deeply personal, universally resonant once more. I think she does just a phenomenal job with this particular tracks where she starts off talking about her own experience and how she got ripped off, and then just starts telling all these hypothetical stories of why is it that when you get a raise you're laughed at? Why is it that no one listens to you in these meetings? Why? And just being like, this, it's all the same condition. They're screwing you just like they're screwing me. It's really, really great. A really important, powerful message that everyone needs to reflect on in their own lives. All of this is delivered with just phenomenal rapping, phenomenal flows. They feel both like super athletic, like intricate, complex, hard hitting, endlessly endlessly variating? What the hell? What am I trying to say here? There's lots of varieties. She keeps changing it up. But at the same time, everything feels so effortless. It just kind of feels like she's just kind of casually spilling out, as if this is the way she naturally talks. This is the way she just naturally arranges her thoughts and experiences. There's a line early on that I think speaks to this, where she says, "When the drums speak to me, I just breathe through it." That her contribution, as significant as it is, as impressive as it is to her just kind of like breathing out over the landscape sonically that's surrounded her. It's just immaculately smooth. The production is so rich, so varied. What amazed me most is the use of like strings and orchestration and stuff. Not in a way that feels like contrived, not in a way that like calls too much attention to itself, but just sort of like bolsters and brings up and elevates kind of more classical hip hop structuring and elements. It reminds me a lot of Late Registration in that regard. It's something that very few people have ever really attempted like this, and I think Late Registration was maybe the most recent big success. So that's saying a lot. It also reminds me a lot of a Jay Electronica album from a couple years ago, A Written Testimony, where he's so confident in his own mode, the way he produces stuff, the way he raps, that it feels like kind of like a fundamental classic that just came from another world that you just happen to not have heard of. It feels like that sure of itself, that entrenched in something that it's creating in that moment. But even though I compare it to Kanye, even though I compare it to Jay Electronica, in terms of the actual performance on this album, when I really think about like what she delivers on each track, who can compare? It's so real. It's so dense. It's so long. Some of these songs are like 8 minutes long and stuff. Who can compare? Maybe Kendrick. We'll get to that. My recommended tracks are Silhouette. This is the one where she first starts really getting into how screwed she feels, out of what she rightfully should have due to her success. It's very intense, very detailed, very specific, to the extent where you're like, are you going to get in trouble for this? But very moving too, and it just really highlights, I think, the variety of production on this album, the variety of her flows and stuff. And then Broken, this is later in the album, it's quite long, and here she really starts kind of speaking universally of, you know, all of this stuff really stressed me out. All of this stuff kind of pushed me to the brink. And then she starts really reflecting on the greater experience of mental health in the Black community, the taboos around it, of seeking help, of admitting weaknesses, the things she's seen, the things that she feels regret around, and then her hope for in the future, better communication, you know, better support. It's extremely moving, extremely powerful, really a phenomenal track. Okay, next we have the latest from 070 Shake. You Can't Kill Me. This is one of my favorite artists working today. I'm just so fascinated by her career. I'm so excited to see where she's going to go as such a fresh new voice, as someone who's made relatively so little music, who has so many great advancements ahead of her. She takes another kind of step out into the world and then also upwards in her overall quality on this one. Everything that captivated me when I first started listening to her in 2018 still comes through strong here. Her rough, reaching, but very crystalline in a way vocals, spilling out these themes of a deeply incomplete yearning, lyrics of strength through loss and vulnerability through intimacy, always on the edge of things being all right, always looking from a place of very fragile okayness into a void, but then always seeming to glimpse a light that's even further away. Intense stuff. And a feeling of sadness in the club. and this thing I find really intoxicating. I think this is something really special about her music. It's not totally unique to her, but I think she conveys it more directly and anchors her music more around this feeling than most people I've seen, where it's like the experience of being out, being in a place with like dance music. You're at a club, you're at a party, you're at a bar, and just being in your own private misery, and the way this kind of distorts what you're feeling and what you're hearing into this kind of nightmarish, claustrophobic, inescapable version of what ought to be a fun time, what ought to be celebration and connection and liberation and stuff. And it's like, isn't that all too real? Haven't you had experiences like that? Aren't those some of the worst times, really, when you're out in a crowd and just feel lonely, when you're 3 drinks deep, but you can't tell if you should just sober up and go home and sleep, or if you're really gonna, or maybe you'll just really go into the pit tonight? I don't know. It just really speaks to these experiences of when the good time is a bad time. She conveys that so well sonically with just kind of these haunting, stripped down, but still like very sonically rich and overwhelming like versions of club music, and then her lyrics that are so longing, so it's so good. I'm gonna get all worked up thinking about times I've felt like this. On her second full-length album, what I think she mostly grows and innovates in is her kind of general sound and the way she's building and forming tracks. These feel like her most mature compositions yet, where she kind of has a solid skeleton of an idea of a song and she kind of grows from there, versus having kind of maybe a specific idea for a vocal performance, or like a specific sound in mind, and kind of letting that form into a song, if that makes sense. It's kind of just like a different mentality. I think the songwriting is evident here. She also really diversifies the sorts of things she composes this whole mood from. There's a lot of strings. There's some really Radiohead-like acoustic guitar and piano. She gets a little more abrasive on this one too. She's always kind of flirted with noisy elements and stuff, but here it kind of reminds me of Arca at times. Just this suddenly very like aggressive and overwhelming noisy influence will just crop up briefly to kind of punctuate things. It feels like she's distilling the most powerful elements of her work, moments that I'm sure through connecting with fans and stuff she's realized really resonated with people. She's kind of focused on that more. She's made it more like approachable in the form and stuff. And obviously I love this. This album ranks highly on my list. But I wouldn't say it's strictly better than her more raw early work, where it felt like, again, that she had very particular moments or sounds in mind, and that everything kind of just spilled out from that. And I think it's, again, kind of speaking to this conversation of what we expect from artists. This is sort of an answer of mastery. that she has found a lot of success and acclaim from this particular kind of mood and sound. And now she's in a place in her life where, this is my assumption, just kind of reading a bit about what her life has been like lately, she's doing pretty good. She's in a relationship, she's a successful musician. I really hope, at least, she's not as miserable as a lot of these tracks are making out. Now, I'm sure these tracks are still very, very real for her, that they're speaking to experiences she's had and feelings she's remembering, and speaking to the journey she's been on to get to this point. But it's not like she's overwhelmed by her compositional project itself anymore. Instead, like, she's in charge of it. She knows how she can convey this stuff in an effective way now, instead of just kind of needing to do it, I guess. So it's very fascinating to me. I'm really excited to see where she goes from here. I think she's just getting better and better at conveying this sort of stuff, and I think she'll emerge as a really amazing talent. My recommended tracks are two with "and" in the title. Skin and Bones. I just love the melody on this one. I think it really conveys her vocal performance, the things that I really love about her vocals, very well. It's just really hypnotic and enchanting while giving you that bad time during what's supposed to be a good time feeling. And then also Wine and Spirits. This is one that I would say feels like it's very like early Radiohead influenced. The guitar, and then just kind of the way that she kind of builds it up structurally and then kind of drags you into it, I think is very powerful. All right, next we have the latest from folk musician Richard Dawson, the Ruby Chord. At last! I shouldn't say at last, I've only been listening to this guy for a couple years, but at last! He completes his trilogy, starting with The Peasant. It's not called The Peasant, sorry, Peasant, which released in like 2017, I think, and looked at kind of the hypothetical lives of medieval peasantry, small stories of things that they may have been going through back in the year like 800. And then in 2020, he looked at hypothetical experiences of people living in the current day. And now, leaping ahead another 1,200 years, he gives us similar slices of life of the far, far future. It's what I would call the Suffering Through the Ages trilogy. It's not all suffering, but most songs range from outright misery to panic to, at best, a sort of resigned melancholy. So yes, we leap another 1,200 years forward and stumble into the incomprehensible future. I absolutely love the way the future is depicted here. It genuinely feels as remote to us now as the medieval period did to us now. I didn't phrase that very well, but they're equally remote. And I think so often people fall into a trap thinking about the future as what we have now, but more. Buying into this great cultural myth that history is ended and things are just kind of generally going to be like this indefinitely. Oh, we're modern now and we're not going to stop being modern. And in the future, cars will just be faster and maybe they'll fly and our phones will have bigger cameras and just like basic enhancements of the stuff we've already got. But Richard Dawson, much more inventive than that, much more imaginative than that, and because of that, much more profound. Here, he seems to suggest that our current, like, institutionalized, organized society is just a blip in a very long history and very long future of ignorance and superstition, of meaning that is very localized geographically, that you only really understand what's going on around you. And just this sense of confused wandering, you know, not really understanding the global lay of the land, but just an incomprehensible life in your small locale. And suggests, and I think very accurately, that even though, you know, we feel like we're very global and we can fly halfway around the world if we want, and we have access to any information we could dream of at the touch of a finger or whatever, that we are still kind of stumbling in the dark, that we are still ignorant and superstitious, that we are only unable to comprehend the very small bubble around us. His vision of the future is so varied, like just the disparateness of the snapshots we see. It's not this kind of like monocultural future where it kind of seems like everybody's just doing the same thing now, but instead it's just as varied as his looks at what modern life is like or what medieval life is like. It's so emotional too. Like the characters he depicts are so deeply invested and impacted by this mysterious world around them. It's like beyond world building. It's not interested in building a world for you that is explained to you. You're just asked to live within it, which I just find amazing. So it starts with this 40-minute long, it reminds me a lot of the recent project by the Microphones, aka Mount Eerie, where he just played guitar and sang intermittently for like 44 minutes. Similarly here, I'd call it kind of like acoustio ambient. This is The Hermit. I've honestly only listened to this twice, I think, and I was very moved by it each time, but it's the rest of the album that really stuck with me. We're treated after that to 5 of his richest and loveliest and most haunting compositions yet. Again, he just weaves these from his signature elements, his hypnotic acoustic guitar playing, his angelic falsetto, his barreling baritone. They continue to grow, to mature, to become more bold, experimental, and to really, really delight, at least me, even though the songs are so goddamn depressing. Everything sonically just feels wreathed in this deeply nostalgic light, where it feels like what we're hearing is sort of the last vestiges and scraps of something that we can recognize to be beautiful, that we can recognize to be meaningful. But it's nostalgic in a way that it's not focused on any particular period of history, but I think quite accurately looks at kind of the scope of human culture as someone would in the year 3200, as all of it kind of just being an equally meaningful blur, an eternity in which we meaningfully do not exist. We're such a tiny blip, while still also getting splashed by the occasional kind of sonic reference to this post-tech despair, this far, far incomprehensible future. Sometimes the tracks will just get buffeted by electronic noise or strange kind of like lasery sounds and stuff, and we're kind of left to think about what that might signify. And then the lyrics too, again, like they're so cryptic, so immersed within our own or within the character's own understanding of their world that we can hardly penetrate their actual meaning. But occasionally you'll get things that you can really discern, like references to someone ripping off the virtual reality goggles of their family members and realizing that they're still comatose, that they still can't be reached, or on the track Museum talking about how they have recordings of what life was like back when humans existed. And we're just kind of left to recognize only emotionally the ramifications of this without really understanding their significance or what they really mean. Let's surrender ourselves to it. Let's surrender ourselves ahistorically. We're not dead at the end of history, because history doesn't meaningfully exist. For most of human life, they had no delusions that they understood where they were or where they were going. And in the future, maybe once again we will abandon any such conceit that we are masters of information, that we are informed, that we are global or culture. The human condition is so much huger and grander than that. Just deaf, blind puppets wandering about an infinite stage, grasping at meaning. That is the human condition. And we need to embrace it because it's beautiful. My recommended tracks are The Fool. This one is sonically just mind-blowing. It tells a very confusing story, that seems like it maybe more at home in the medieval period. Very unclear what any of it means, but the emotional significance still hits home. And then in the choruses, he sings in this like blooming, sunny, overwhelming way about the power of love, and it feels like the stuff I love best from the Beatles. And then The Tip of an Arrow. This is one of the longer tracks that tells again a very confusing story that at first seems like very primitive, about gathering materials to make arrowheads to slay some bizarre beast. But the more you kind of try to break down actually what's being discussed and kind of focus in on very bizarre lines, it seems like maybe this is more like two robots talking to each other, or perhaps this is taking place inside of a video game. Very confusing, but definitely something that really highlights, I think, his strengths as a songwriter, just telling this one long, continuous, confusing story. Okay, let's move into the top two. We're hitting the hour mark. Thanks for sticking with me. I'm having a blast. This has been such a great year for music. And the top two are both huge bangers. First off, we have Ants from Up There by Black Country New Road. This is another one that got a whole lot of buzz and attention this year. And for me, it absolutely lived up to the hype. Because when I was a kid, my favorite album for a very long time was Arcade Fire's Funeral. I loved that album to death. That album blew my mind in ways that almost nothing ever has since. And that album, very appropriately, kickstarted an entire genre revolution. That album basically made the white man's indie for the last, 18 years. But it's all this stupid stomp, clap, hoot, and holler. We're in the barn with all your buds. Meaningless, embarrassing indie rock. Of course, there's exceptions. There's a lot of other indie rock albums I like that have come out since Funeral that were inspired by Funeral. But for the most part, it felt like nobody really understood what made Funeral great, and we're just hoping to kind of ape the most surface level instrumentation and concepts and stuff. No. Funeral is so much more than that. It's chaotic. It's every instrument's it. It's this melodically fuguey chamber pop that's arranged into these crazy fractal song structures. Everything is driven by this manic singer who A, seems to know everything, B, have the mind of a child, and C, be on the edge of suicidal depression. All at once on every single line. Spiraling through this cryptic inner language of anxieties, airing out fears and hopes in this intimate code, building up these images and fantasies, nightmares and dreams that the listener isn't really expected to understand, but nevertheless managed to resonate with huge audiences. This is the power of Funeral. And of course, Arcade Fire's reputation is in the trash because Win Butler is a sex pest and pervert and creep and weirdo, and that sucks because I really loved their early music. But they themselves kind of started smelling their own farts, it seemed like, and kind of lost the plot on what made their music great in the first place. This is what made Funeral great. It was such a triumph of an album. And barely anything else that kind of came along in this white man's indie genre even attempts something that grand. Until now. Now we finally have a worthy successor. Okay, so Funeral, when I talk about its private language and stuff, it was telling some bizarre story of suburban apocalypse. Our neighborhoods are fighting. It's gonna snow forever. All the lights are out forever. I'm gonna stop sleeping. It builds up just this whole fantastical world in and of itself, as this one does too. So what's this one about? Well, it's the most down bad album of all time, I think. It's as down bad as Henry VIII, as the Concorde jet, as down bad of having wet dreams about Charlie, and saying goodbye to people that are off to Berlin for a little while. It's just so hopelessly down bad, so hopelessly pining, at turns seeming to both hate its object of affection and be so overwhelmed with love that the singer becomes just irretrievable from that place of delusion. Almost every song ends up pointing to this direction. Even if it seems to have kind of other narratives and themes at first, it so authentically represents the domination of the mind by someone who's truly down bad that inevitably their thoughts will steer back towards the unattainable love. I started this year when this album came out back in like February. At that time, I was as down bad as I've ever been. I'm not going to get into it now, but looking back at it, yeesh, I was down terrible. And now, ending it, I'm very happy to say, this is the least down bad I've ever been. This is the least I've been pining over someone unattainable. This is. I'm so far removed from those feelings. I'm so far in the opposite direction of reciprocated wonderful love that it's kind of crazy how much has changed within this year. And so when I look back to this album and when I think about how I was experiencing it then, I still feel something resonate so deeply inside of me, something so much in the core humanness of myself. At first, it was an empathy that I was like, yeah, that's me. And now it's in sympathy, which is honestly no less strong. That I feel now instead of my comrade in despair, I hear this as someone who is so far removed from me, but I can still understand them emotionally. And I listen to it with this doomed, impossible, crazy hope that, hey, maybe you'll make it. And I know they won't. And I know that it's going to get worse for them before it gets better. And looking back at it, no, that was true for me too. But in the end, you can still be happy in other ways. And I think it's that kind of like greater perspective that I feel emerging when I listen to this now of like, hey, you know, in a few years you won't care about this at all. In a few months even you might not care about this at all. It's a very powerful feeling too, just this kind of almost wisdom that it makes me reflect on. It's great. And who knows where I'll be next, and who knows what this band will do next too. Again, we keep coming back to this conversation about what do artists owe us. And here we get an answer that's quite sad, where the singer, after recording this album, what's his name? Isaac someone? Sorry. I'm a great music journalist. He felt so overwhelmed by the pressure of the band's growing success and their fame, and I think, you know, he was probably so in awe of what they created that he was almost afraid of what this would mean for the band after it was released, and he quit. He said, I'm out. I don't want to keep performing with you guys. And now they're working with a variety of other vocalists. They're still making new music. I can't wait to hear it. But it's I don't know. It's kind of, it's you know, in the end, artists owe us nothing. They're allowed to say no. They're allowed to say that's enough, and say you can enjoy what I've given you, but you aren't entitled to a note more. And you know, that's what he said. All right, my recommended tracks are Good Will Hunting. This one I think really shows off their kind of strong song structuring, compositional skills. It reminds me a lot of tracks on Funeral, where they kind of start in a typical fashion, alternating choruses and verses, feeling like it's building up to something. But what it builds up to is just something with such steamrolling momentum that the entire band feels transfixed in this moment, just repeating it and growing it and exploding within it. It's so great. I sing the chorus of it, which repeats so many times at the end, over and over to myself sometimes in a weird, happy, manic state. And then Snow Globes. This one is a little more atypical. The last few songs on the album, I think, deliver in a really phenomenal way this sense of. I always said this about Broken Social Scene's legendary album, You Forgot It in People, that like the last like 5 tracks, every one of them feels like the finale, and then it feels like it transcends that even further with an even more finale song. And this album does that too in a really great way. Snow Globes just has one of the craziest breakdowns at the end I've ever heard. It's so passionate, so powerful. It really, I think, reflects just how esoteric the inner language of this album is. What the hell does it mean that snow globes don't shake on their own? But even if we don't know what the hell that means, we know how it feels. It's great. Okay, what could top that? Well, I alluded to it briefly before. I don't know if this will be a big surprise to anyone who has been watching my videos for a while, but it's Kendrick Lamar's new album, Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers. I already talked about this album for an hour. I'm not sure what else to say. If you go back to when this album came out in May, I uploaded a video soon after where I just talked about it endlessly. I responded to, at the time, the current controversies around it. I kind of argued with some of the reviews I'd read about it. I had a sense that like nobody really understood it. After that, I saw him live. It was really an amazing concert. He really masterfully brought together all sorts of different eras of his career. The narrative of the album, accentuated by other songs that he kind of thematically linked, played out live on stage in a really compelling way. There was some music videos, there's some other kind of supporting content that emerged. Also very compelling, also very contextualizing as to what his vision is. And honestly, it feels like so much of what he was saying has been validated. And in turn, what I was saying about this album, I think, has been validated a lot. Not so much that it's like the truth, that his takes were necessarily super accurate. Although personally, I think there's very little on this album that's actually disagreeable, but we got into that at length during the 1 hour video before. But I think his ability to understand what the conversations of 2022 are is really cognizant, really shows how immersed he was in these waves of paranoia, in these waves of conflict and agitation, and how much he really understood what needed to be said. Even if people didn't like his message, I'm sure at this point, no one can deny that he was talking about what needed to be talked about this year. And honestly, like, if we look at all of the other kind of figures having that conversation back in May, he's come across as relatively so much better than basically everyone else. Almost everyone else just shot themselves in the foot repeatedly from that point on. So I don't know. I feel more and more validated in being like a champion of this album, in giving Kendrick the benefit of the doubt on a lot of stuff, and like really pushing myself to see it through his perspective. Because man, he really knew what was up. So stripping away all this context, though, stripping away all the controversies around this, all the characterization you can give Kendrick, and all the other kind of like actors that he speaks on, what sticks with me the most is the sheer power of this performance. I can still remember the first time I listened to this, I was just in awe. I was sitting out on my balcony, doing something that I need to do on my balcony, listening to it and reading along with the lyrics as I did, and just feeling this amazing, almost like suspense, where I would read a little bit ahead and I would start to anticipate, like, ooh, like what kind of flow is he going to use for this? How is he going to like vary it? How is he going to switch it up to hit these lines? And just being blown away each and every time with the sheer amount of creativity in the delivery of like every bar on this album. It feels unmatched how deep he's gone into just the raw art form that is rap. And it's a pretty bold take to say Kendrick's gone further than Nas, than MF Doom, than I don't know, like the early greats, Cool G rap and stuff, Jay-Z, but like I don't know. This album is such a testament to how creative you can be, to how much you can express yourself. And the other thing that makes this album so special to me is, again, we can talk about this conversation. What do artists owe the world? Kendrick is someone who's had more demanded of him than almost anyone else. He made songs like All Right that were adopted as like the Black Lives Matter anti-police anthem. He was seen as someone who could be a savior of race relations in America, which is ridiculous. And so much of this album is him directly saying, you know, I struggled with this. I tried to live up to what you expected of me, but in the end I have to choose me. I'm sorry. He feels genuinely sorry, but he has to choose himself. And this is a year where, again, I'm not gonna get into this because I'll probably start crying or something, and it's none of your business. But I made a very big choice early on in this year where essentially I chose myself over someone else, and this is the first time I've ever had to do that. It's the first time that what I wanted and what someone else wanted was in major conflict, and I chose what I wanted. And I think it's one of the best decisions I've ever made in my life, honestly. And I am sorry. I'm so, so sorry that it had to be this way, that I had to make that choice. But I chose me. And hearing Kendrick say those same things on this album hit so deeply. And hearing it again, still, like probably forever, whenever I listen to this album, I'll remember this. And of course, his situation is so different, but just those simple words resonate so much with me. I chose me. Yeah. I'm glad I put that in there. At first I was like, I don't know if I want to talk about this. I'll probably get pretty emotional. It's pretty personal. But that's how I feel. My recommended tracks were really hard to pick because this album is so varied. It's hard to know, like, you know, the really emotionally climactic moments on this album are one thing, and then there's some other ones that are just straight bangers that I'll listen to over and over again. I kind of lean more in that direction, you know, just the tracks that I think will convey to you most quickly and directly and catchily how great this album is. Father Time, which features Sampha, who's like one of my favorite voices in music, period. He just has like an absolute golden voice, really brings a lot to this track, which is a really touching study on Kendrick's relationship with his dad. And then Silent Hill, which in my book is like the number one banger on this album. Just, it's so good, dude. He kind of has like the Playboy Cardi flair, but then he just goes so hard with it, and then Kodak shows up, and Kodak does like the best verse he's ever done in his life. Great stuff, great stuff. Okay, that's it. Good list. I'm really happy with this. Hopefully I can keep up this momentum and do the rest of the 2022 lists. Basically my projects are movies. Probably going to do top 15 movies just because I've seen so friggin' many movies this year. So many I want to talk about. Anime, but that will happen after the seasonal anime review video. I'll also do top 10 anime. And then I'm thinking maybe I'll do like top 10 Smash Brothers Melee players or something. And I also want to do a video talking about YouTube channels I've really liked in the last year. So a lot to come, but I think I'm off to a good start. I'm really happy with this list. I had a lot of fun making it. And hopefully you had a lot of fun watching this video too. Okay. That's all. Bye-bye.